Happy Monday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where we discuss leading political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Of course, the big China news in recent days has been the fragile truce between the world's two largest economies, the US and China, appearing to be collapsing once again. We covered these developments closely with Friday's and Saturday's videos. We continue that coverage now. On Sunday, US Trade Representative Jamison Greer revealed that China had deferred a request for talks just days after the US President Donald Trump announced plans to impose a sweeping 100% tariff on all Chinese goods starting November the 1st, bringing the effective tariff rate up to 130%, and a move which sent further shockwaves through global markets. The escalation comes after Beijing tightened export controls on rare earth minerals and magnets, key components in everything from smartphones to fighter jets. Greer described China's move as a, quote, power grab, end quote, saying Washington was blindsided. He told US-based Fox's Sunday briefing yesterday, quote, "We were not notified. As soon as we found out from public sources, we reached out to the Chinese to have a phone call, and they deferred," end quote. The lack of communication has fueled unease in Washington, where policymakers fear that Beijing's control over roughly 90% of global rare earths processing capacity could be weaponized to pressure the US and its allies. The news, coupled with the US response with tariff threats, helped trigger a $2 trillion market sell-off on Friday, marking Wall Street's worst day in months. Yet, the US President Donald Trump appeared to strike a softer tone on Sunday, posting on his Truth Social platform, quote, "Don't worry about China, it will all be fine. Highly respected President Xi has just had a bad moment. He doesn't want depression for his country, and neither do I," end quote. The mixed signals have left both investors and US allies unsure about what to expect next. Beijing officials insisted Washington had instigated the confrontation. China's Commerce Ministry said the rare earth restrictions were not an export ban, but a new licensing system, and claimed other countries had been notified in advance. However, as we've seen all throughout this year, China has periodically put restrictions on rare earths, causing choke points for many, not just in the US, but around the world, in trying to get these critical minerals. Still, Chinese manufacturers are already feeling the chill. Toy maker Alan Chow in southern China told US-based The Wall Street Journal that his American clients froze orders when Trump first raised tariffs to 145% earlier this year. The brief May truce allowed shipments to resume, but the looming November tariffs have once again placed his company, quote, on the brink, end quote. The tariff shock has roiled global markets and cast doubt on a potential meeting between Trump and Xi at the upcoming Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. Analysts say the chances of de-escalation are dim. Quote, "It's unclear whether the two sides are willing to de-escalate at this juncture to save the bilateral meeting," end quote, said Wendy Cutler, former US trade negotiator and vice president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Quote, "Beijing has become increasingly assertive, believing it has the upper hand in the bilateral relationship," end quote. This may be a misplaced belief, however, especially considering the tariff standoff comes at a dangerous moment for China's slowing economy, which has been grappling with weak domestic demand, a fragile property sector, and faltering investor confidence. After a brief rebound in the first half of the year, powered by strong exports to developed markets, and we will be discussing new export data published today in tomorrow's video, momentum is fading fast. Official data show exports to the US fell more than 15% year-on-year in the first 8 months of 2025, even as total exports grew by nearly 6%. As we'll discuss tomorrow, this is leading to quite a reaction in many economies, however, and this does show how dependent Chinese manufacturing remains on global demand and US consumer markets. Eswar Prasad, professor of trade policy at Cornell University and a former IMF official, observed yesterday, quote, "The strength of China's overall exports despite US tariff barriers may have emboldened Xi to take the risk of escalation, but this approach could backfire given persistently weak domestic consumption and rising fears abroad about being swamped by cheap Chinese goods," end quote. At home, consumer spending and private investment remain sluggish. Despite a series of piecemeal stimulus measures from Beijing, youth unemployment has surged, the housing market remains depressed, and business confidence is fragile. Indeed, as an aside, let's look at the latest property sector data that was released today. China's property market had showed flickering signs of recovery in September before momentum quickly faded over the Golden Week holiday, which ended last week. The nation's top 100 developers recorded recorded $35.5 billion in contracted sales that month, up 22.1% from August and 0.4% year-on-year, according to China Real Estate Information Corp. Yet during the October 1st through 8th National Day break, the Golden Week holiday, new home subscriptions in 22 major cities plunged 33% from a year earlier and 38% from September. The uneven trend once again painfully shows how fragile the housing rebound remains despite policy support. Looser purchase requirements in Beijing, Shanghai and Shenzhen briefly lifted sales, up 52%, 3% and 22% respectively, but national demand stayed weak. Analysts said September's gains reflected temporary factors, including seasonal promotions and a low 2024 base. With cumulative sales still down 11.8% for the first 9 months and October activity likely subdued, a broad property revival continues to look out of reach. And this is after over $15 trillion of wealth gone and half a decade of malaise. Now, we return to the trade war developments. Jeffrey Ma, a Guangzhou-based exporter, told Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post, quote, "Many small and mid-sized exporters have been surviving on razor-thin margins. If another wave of tariffs hit, we'll have to either cut prices further or move production to Southeast Asia." End quote. Indeed, some factory owners are already exploring relocation to Vietnam, Indonesia or Malaysia, seeking to avoid the volatility of US-China trade policies. Such moves are costly and complex. The risk for Beijing is that the prolonged tariff war could undermine its growth targets, leaving policymakers with few good options. Large-scale stimulus risks inflating China's already massive levels of debt, while austerity could choke off recovery. Iswar Prasad of Cornell University, who we just quoted before, observed, quote, "The government seems reluctant to launch another major stimulus, but doing nothing could mean stagnation." End quote. Alan Cho, the toy maker we quoted before, paints an even more concerning picture. If the 100% tariffs take effect, he warns, quote, "half the factories in our region would shut down by Christmas." End quote. Now we have 2 more developments to cover, but just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you want to be on top of all things China, including this new stage in the US-China tech and trade war, consider subscribing to China Update, hit the bell notification icon, and you will be. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. I appreciate all the amazing support from the community here. Thank you so much, everyone, for all the wonderful support. Next up, Chinese Premier Qiang arrived in Pyongyang on Thursday of last week for a 3-day visit aimed at strengthening ties with North Korea, marking the highest-level Chinese trip to the country since 2019. The visit coincided with celebrations for the 80th anniversary of North Korea's ruling Workers' Party and comes amid a notable thaw in bilateral relations. During his visit, Li reportedly attended several official events, including a military parade commemorating the founding of the party. In a statement, he said China was ready to work with Pyongyang to, quote, "strengthen strategic communication, maintain close exchanges, and advance friendly cooperation to promote regional peace and stability," end quote. The visit follows a recent surge in high-level exchanges between the two nations. Last month, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un traveled to China to attend a military parade marking the end of World War II and to meet with General Secretary Xi Jinping. Li described that meeting as having, quote, "charted the course for future ties," end quote, while China's ambassador to North Korea called it, quote, "an important opportunity to further develop friendly and cooperative relations," end quote. Xi Jinping also sent a congratulatory message to North Korea. Li's visit, the first by a Chinese premier since Wen Jiabao in 2009, suggests Beijing's growing efforts to solidify regional alliances as tensions mount over global security and economic challenges. Both sides have vowed to, quote, "open a new chapter in the socialist cause," end quote, reinforcing their shared political and strategic alignment. And speaking of regional tensions, this brings us to our final development. Yet again, tensions between China and the Philippines have surged once more in the South China Sea after vessels from both nations collided near the disputed Titu Island on Sunday. The incident marks the latest in a series of very dangerous encounters amid escalating rival territorial claims. According to China's Coast Guard, 2 Philippine government vessels, quote, illegally intruded into disputed waters without authorization. The Chinese Coast Guard spokesperson said one Philippine ship, quote, dangerously approached, end quote, a Chinese vessel despite repeated warnings, causing a collision, quote, for which the Philippine side bears full responsibility, end quote. He insisted Chinese forces acted, quote, professionally and lawfully, end quote, while expelling the vessels, and reaffirmed Beijing's, quote, indisputable sovereignty, end quote, over the Spratly Islands. The Philippine Coast Guard offered a sharply different account, accusing the Chinese side of deliberately ramming its vessel after using a water cannon, leaving minor damage but no injuries, a description very much consistent with previous Chinese behavior in this region. Manila denounced the actions as, quote, bullying tactics and a clear threat, end quote, releasing photos and videos showing Chinese ships shadowing its patrol. The US, a treaty ally of the Philippines, immediately condemned China's, quote, aggressive actions in defiance of international law, end quote, with the US ambassador praising Filipino sailors for their valor and skill. The clash comes amid Beijing's growing assertiveness at sea, including recent patrols and a controversial plan to establish a nature reserve at Scarborough Shoal, which Manila calls unlawful, and indeed likely is. China's military has warned the Philippines to, quote, stop provocations and avoid bringing in external forces, end quote, here referring to its ally, the US. Both nations refused to back down. Sunday's collision once again provides a disquieting reminder of how the South China Sea remains one of the world's most combustible flashpoints at a time where global tensions are at their worst levels in decades. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. A big one. It's probably going to be a big week. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Monday. Have a productive week. And I hope to see you for another episode of China Update tomorrow.